The chair is in the same spot it has been for 11 years. You know this because you put it there and nobody has moved it since. Saturday afternoon, light comes through the window at a specific angle around 2 p.m., the kind of light that doesn't ask anything of you. The television is on, but not loud. Something with a game, or a documentary about something you half care about. The sound turned down just enough that it becomes ambient rather than demanding. There is a cup of coffee on the table beside you. It has gone slightly cold and you have not touched it in 40 minutes, and this does not bother you at all. This is your life, not a placeholder for some other life. This one. There is no woman on the other side of the apartment loading the dishwasher with the wrong technique. No argument brewing about whose turn it was to call the plumber. No schedule negotiation. No weekend social calendar assembled by someone else. No low-grade obligation filling the air like weather. Just the specific silence of a space that is arranged entirely according to your preferences, your tolerances, your sense of order. A space where the remote control is always exactly where you left it because you are the only person who touches it. To a significant portion of mainstream culture, this scene looks like a problem, a symptom, evidence of something that went wrong somewhere. 40-something or 50-something, alone on a Saturday, coffee going cold, not talking to anyone. That image has been loaded with a particular cultural meaning that you have probably encountered at family dinners, in articles you didn't finish, in the concerned expressions of people who are themselves 3 arguments away from a divorce. Here is what they got wrong. Most of it. This video is not about men who are hiding from life. It is about men who built a specific kind of life that does not fit the template and have been misread ever since. The psychology behind how they got here is more coherent, more deliberate, and frankly more interesting than the standard story. The research tells a different story than the headlines. And the men themselves, the ones sitting in chairs exactly like yours, in apartments exactly like this one, on Saturday afternoons, exactly like this one, have been carrying a label that was written by people who never actually studied them. That label is wrong. And we are going to go through exactly why. Let's get something out of the way immediately, because this video will not be useful to you if you spend the first 10 minutes waiting for the part where it tells you something is wrong with you. The assumption, stated plainly, goes like this. A man who lives alone past the age of 45 is either someone who could not sustain a relationship, someone who is quietly miserable and lacks the self-awareness to realize it, or in the more charitable framing, someone who has simply given up. This assumption shows up in wellness journalism, in public health campaigns, in the specific tone of voice your brother-in-law uses when he asks how you are doing. It is delivered sometimes with pity, sometimes with mild alarm, occasionally with the kind of concern that is actually just disapproval dressed in softer clothing. The assumption is not entirely invented. Social isolation, meaning the objective absence of social contact, is genuinely associated with negative health outcomes. That data is real. Nobody here is going to pretend otherwise. But social isolation and chosen solitude are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. Researchers who have actually distinguished between the two, and this distinction turns out to matter enormously, have found that voluntary solitude is associated with higher emotional regulation, lower baseline cortisol, and a stronger reported sense of personal agency. The mechanism is different. The outcomes are different. The psychological profile is different. The man in that chair is not isolated. He is selective. These are not synonyms, and the fact that the culture treats them as synonyms is the first thing worth correcting. The second thing worth correcting is considerably more interesting. To understand how the wrong story got told, you have to understand who was doing the telling. The post-World War II social architecture of the United States, and to a slightly lesser degree, Britain, Canada, and Australia, was built around a specific unit: the married couple with children, the owned home, the embedded community. This was not merely a cultural preference. It was policy. The GI Bill financed it. The tax code incentivized it. The entire apparatus of mid-century institutional life was calibrated for it. A man who fell outside that structure was not just unconventional. He was, in the language of the time, a problem to be explained. That architecture was already cracking by the time Gen X came along. But the mental health establishment's diagnostic frameworks had been built inside it. The American Psychological Association's early models of adult male health were developed almost entirely from research conducted on married men. Single, Middle-aged men were underrepresented in the data and overrepresented in the clinical concern. When something showed up in the numbers that looked like distress, the assumption was that the absence of partnership was the cause, rather than a correlated variable with a dozen other explanations. Then came the 1990s, and the cultural archetype that absorbed every Gen X man who wasn't performing conventional domesticity, the emotionally unavailable male. This was the decade that turned a clinical observation into a personality verdict. Glossy magazines, self-help publishing, and eventually television took a real but narrow psychological phenomenon and applied it wholesale to any man who valued his own space, his own time, and his own silence. The archetype required a diagnosis. The diagnosis required a pathology. And so a man who had simply built his life differently found himself drafted into a story he had not written and did not recognize. No equivalent moral panic attached itself to women who chose solitary lives. That particular go back to 1979, or 1981, or 1983. The specific year doesn't matter as much as the specific time. 3. 30 inches the afternoon. You are 10 years old, or 11, or 9. You get off the school bus, or you walk, because the distance is reasonable, and no one has told you it isn't, and you come to a door. You have a key. It is on a piece of string or a worn-out lanyard, and it lives around your neck during school hours because losing it is not an option you have been given. You put the key in the lock, you open the door, and the house is quiet. Not the temporary quiet of a parent who has stepped outside. A structural quiet. A quiet that means you have 3 hours, or 4, before anyone else is home. The refrigerator hums. The afternoon light sits differently in an empty house. There is no one to report to, no one to ask permission from, no one to perform being fine for. You make something to eat. You watch whatever you want. You solve whatever small problems arise, a stuck window, homework you don't understand, boredom using whatever you have available, which is yourself. This was not exceptional. According to sociological surveys conducted throughout the 1980s, approximately 40% of Gen X children regularly came home to empty houses. The term latchkey kid was coined in that era not as a criticism but as a demographic descriptor. It described a generation being trained, without anyone formally deciding to train them, in a specific set of competencies. Self-regulation without an audience. Problem-solving without assistance. Comfort with silence. Tolerance for solitude that did not require anyone else to validate it. The grown man in that apartment on that Saturday afternoon did not wake up one day and decide to be comfortable alone. He was practicing this at age 10 in a house that smelled like nobody home. The competency was installed early and reinforced over years. By the time he reached adulthood, solitude was not a condition he was enduring. It was a mode he already knew how to operate in, and in many cases, operated in better than most of what social life had to offer him. That is not pathology. That is a skill acquired early under specific historical conditions. The popular narrative about single men and loneliness is heavy on assertion and notably light on methodology. So let's look at what the actual research found when researchers bothered to look carefully. Start with Bella DiPaolo, a social psychologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who has spent 2 decades doing something that sounds simple and turned out to be deeply inconvenient for the standard narrative. She read the actual studies. In her analysis of over 800 pieces of research on single adults, DiPaolo found that the single equals miserable conclusion was consistently contaminated by what she identified as singleism, a built-in assumption within the research design itself that marriage was the normative endpoint of healthy adult life, which meant that deviations from it were coded as deficiencies before the data was even collected. Her findings did not make the cover of Time magazine. They rarely do when they complicate the preferred story. Then there is Thuy Nguyen, a psychologist at Durham University, whose 2018 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology examined what actually happens to people during periods of solitude under controlled conditions. Her sample of 108 participants was put through structured periods of social engagement and structured periods of solitude. The results were not what the loneliness epidemic framing would predict. Solitude produced significant reductions in emotional reactivity, meaning that after time alone, participants were measurably less volatile, less impulsive, and demonstrated stronger self-reported clarity about their own preferences. The study carefully separated chosen solitude from forced isolation. The benefits were specific to the chosen variety. This matters because it suggests something that the chair and cold coffee scene already implies. The man who engineers solitude into his life may not be retreating from emotional health. He may be maintaining it. Jeffrey Grafe, a professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, adds another layer. His long-term research on male friendship patterns found something that explains a measurement problem running through almost all the loneliness data. Men consistently undercount their friendships when surveyed because they do not classify their primary mode of connection, shared activity, parallel presence, practical assistance as friendship in the way the survey instrument assumes. The survey asks about emotional intimacy. The man answers about emotional intimacy. The parallel activity. The 20-year friendship conducted almost entirely over tools or sports or the specific shorthand of men who have known each other long enough to not need to explain anything that goes unrecorded. The data says he's isolated. He would say the data doesn't know what it's measuring. Robert Putnam's work in Bowling Alone documented the broad decline of civic participation across generations, but also showed something specific about Gen X. They maintained informal social networks, small, high, trust, low performance at rates that didn't show up in the institutional membership metrics the study was designed to capture. They just weren't joiners, which is not the same as being alone. There is a word for what the research has been circling without quite naming. It is not introversion, though introverts know the territory. It is not stoicism, though the aesthetic overlaps. It is not isolation, which implies an absence. And it is not loneliness, which is the word that gets applied to it most often and most incorrectly. What it actually is requires a specific term, because the existing vocabulary keeps pulling in the wrong direction. Call it sovereign solitude. Sovereign solitude is the condition of a man who has built an internal world substantial enough that external social validation is genuinely optional, not suppressed, not denied, not stoically endured, but actually structurally optional. It is not a performance of not needing people. It is not a defense mechanism wearing the mask of contentment. The distinction matters because a performance eventually cracks under pressure, and a defense mechanism requires constant maintenance. Sovereign solitude does neither of these things. It simply operates at a different center of gravity than the social world expects. The man in this condition is not waiting. He is not between relationships, not recovering from something, not in a holding pattern until real life resumes. His life is already running, the projects, the routines, the specific accumulated pleasures of a life shaped entirely by his own preferences over decades. These constitute a full environment. The apartment is not empty. It is occupied by everything he has actually chosen. Sovereign solitude is commonly confused with three things: depression, which shrinks the world and drains it of color; avoidant attachment, which fears connection and constructs distance to manage that fear; and misanthropy, which resents the world and requires its presence in order to push against it. Sovereign solitude does none of these. The world is not threatening, not resented, not being avoided. It is simply not required right now. The man with the cold coffee is not hiding from anything. He is, by most functional measures, exactly where he wants to be. Here is where the standard analysis always misses the point. The assumption is that a man living the architecture described in this video is a man without meaningful connection. The assumption is wrong, but the error is understandable. It comes from measuring connection using a template that was designed by and for a different relational style, one that prizes verbal disclosure, emotional narration, face-to-face processing of internal states. Therapy's model of intimacy. The model that shows up in survey instruments, in magazine articles, in the question, "How are you really doing?" delivered with a certain weight. That model captures one kind of connection. There is another kind. Jeffrey Greif's research calls it shoulder-to-shoulder friendship connection that happens through parallel activity rather than direct emotional exchange. Two men watching a game. Two men working on an engine. The conversation that consists almost entirely of technical information and occasional observations about what is in front of them. The friendship that is 22 years old and has never once involved either party explaining how they feel about anything. This is not a lesser form of connection. It is a different architecture, and for a generation raised on self-sufficiency, raised in empty houses, raised to solve problems rather than narrate them, it is often the more natural one. The man practicing sovereign solitude is not without his people. He has the friend he calls when something breaks, because that friend knows things and comes without drama. He has the neighbor whose name he might not know but whose rhythms he recognizes. He has the 10-year acquaintance with whom he shares a specific, narrow band of interests so precisely that no broader social performance is required. He maintains these connections with competence and consistency. He just doesn't call it intimacy, which is, of course, exactly what it is. Let's say plainly what the evidence actually shows. The traits that drew cultural pathologizing, the preference for solitude, the resistance to conventional partnership structures, the self-sufficiency that reads as emotional unavailability to people who measure availability in a specific currency, are not the residue of something broken. They are the output of a coherent developmental sequence that begins in a house at 3:30 inches the afternoon and runs forward across 40 years without interruption. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called autotelic individuals, people who derive their motivation from internal sources rather than external feedback or social reward. His research found that this profile was associated with higher sustained engagement, deeper concentration, and a more stable sense of meaning than profiles organized around social validation. The Gen X man who built a life of sovereign solitude represents an extreme of this distribution, but an extreme that the research does not pathologize. It describes. There is a difference between those two things. David Geary, an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Missouri, has documented male-specific autonomous behavioral patterns across cultures' tendencies toward independent goal pursuit, skill acquisition, and the organization of activity around competence rather than affiliation. These are not cultural artifacts of toxic masculinity, whatever that phrase is currently being made to mean. They are documented, cross-cultural regularities in male behavioral motivation. They predate the latchkey era by several thousand years. What the latchkey era did was select for these traits, filter for them. The boys who came through those empty houses and built functional, independent lives were not damaged by the experience. They were calibrated by it. The ones who needed constant social scaffolding had a harder time. The ones who had the internal resources to fill their own hours emerged with something you cannot install in adulthood: a genuine relationship with their own company. The culture called it damage. The data calls it a profile. A specific, functional, internally consistent profile that happens not to require what the culture decided was mandatory. That chair, that window, that light at 2 p.m. This was always the destination, not a consolation prize. Come back to the apartment. The same chair. The afternoon light through the same window. The coffee is still cold. This continues not to matter. Something is on television at low volume. Outside, the city or the suburb or the small town is doing its Saturday things. Couples at farmers markets, families running errands. The whole apparatus of lives organized around other people. None of it is happening in here. In here it is quiet in the specific way that a man learns to recognize as not emptiness, but its opposite of fullness that requires no commentary. The boy who came through the door at 3:30 with the key around his neck did not know he was being trained. Nobody sat him down and explained that the hours alone in that house were building something durable. Nobody framed it as preparation. It was just Tuesday. It was just the particular texture of being 10 years old in 1,979 inches, a country where mothers had recently entered the workforce and the infrastructure had not caught up yet. But Tuesday ran into Wednesday, and Wednesday into years. And eventually the boy became a man who knows exactly how to be in a room by himself without it meaning anything is missing. There is a word for the thing he built. The research supports it. The data, read carefully and honestly, does not contradict it. He just always called it home. If you watch this to the end, you probably already know someone who should see it. You will not make a big deal of sending it. You will just send it. That is, as it happens, a fairly accurate description of how you do most things. There is more on this channel. None of it will tell you what to feel.